As a new school year begins, with teachers and students returning to their classrooms, and a new church year is underway, since in our tradition the academic calendar and the liturgical calendar are more or less the same, it seems like as good a time as any to reflect upon the noble vocation of teaching, which, as it happens, has been on my mind throughout the summer. I'm not sure whether I've been in a particularly nostalgic frame of mind, or if I've simply been responding to external stimuli. But I've been thinking about my teachers a lot lately. I mean a lot. Both the good ones, who are almost too many to enumerate, and the poor ones, who are rare enough to be memorable because they were the exceptions to my overall experience. Early in July, I conducted a memorial service here at the church for a retired physicist who had been a member of the faculty of the University of Manitoba for several decades. Naturally enough, the service was attended by several colleagues from each of the city's universities, as well as educators from the public schools, both active and retired. The readings for the service were carefully selected in consultation with his family and included a passage from Carl Sagan's Cosmos, which I read early in the service, and another passage from the Meditations of Marcus Aurelius, which I read in lieu of a prayer towards the end. During the reception that followed the service, I enjoyed many lengthy conversations with several individuals, some of whom had a passing acquaintance with this church, some of whom were part of our church alumni association, but all of whom had been taken by the readings. It's interesting, I have never used Carl Sagan's Cosmos in a memorial service until this year, even though I routinely use passages from Sagan in my sermons. And at both services that I have done where I have used Cosmos, perhaps in lieu of the book of Genesis, I have been flooded with people afterwards to talk with me about the selection of the reading. It's really been quite remarkable. Some were surprised by the selections, and all seemed pleased by them, pointing out that they stood in stark contrast to the readings commonly heard at memorial services. I can often slip away from these receptions partway through, once those who wish to speak with the minister have had their chance. But on this occasion, I stayed until the end, because so many people wanted my ear, if only for a moment. One of the individuals with whom I had spoken at some length, and who was very familiar with this church, introduced me to her husband, and we began a lengthy and wide-ranging conversation. There was something vaguely familiar about him, but I couldn't quite put my finger on it. But I felt as though I had met him before, as though I knew him from some other place. And as we were speaking, my mind processed where that might have been. We spoke about the church and its openness to the findings of science and the wisdom of philosophy. And I spoke at length about the influence that Carl Sagan had on my own thinking. He asked me about my path to ministry after I had suggested that I viewed my vocation as more anthropologist than theologian. And I explained that I had entered university planning to study political science on my way to law school, but that a chain of events during my first year led me to change course. During the first term, my dad died unexpectedly on the eve of exam week. and the kindness of my professors helped get me through a very difficult month. When school resumed in the new year, the thing that motivated me to get out of bed in the morning, which I no longer cared to do, was an 8:30 anthropology class that I found fascinating. It was actually more than just fascinating. It was healing, not a word that you would usually use to describe the study of anthropology. From September through November, it had been this class that led to many rich conversations with my dad, who had a passion for the subject. And after he died, attending the class had helped me feel still connected to him, although I missed our conversations about the subject matter. Instead, I would corner the professor at the end of class to discuss what he had already explained. It was, in a sense, replacing my father's voice in a conversation that I didn't want to leave behind when it was time to move on to the next class. It also helped me to continue to develop my own worldview in Dad's absence, even to better understand him, since Dad relied on anthropology more than religion in understanding the world in which he lived. More than anything else, I said, that class and that professor helped me navigate the months that followed the loss of my father. By the end of the year, encouraged by my professor, I changed my major to anthropology, planning to study ethnology with a focus on folklore and religion. And that I did. Curious, the man asked me, "Who was your professor?" "Dr. Chris Meiklejohn," I replied. I never had him again, because he was a physical anthropologist, and my trajectory eventually led me to the Department of Religious Studies. But that year, he changed my life forever. The man stared at me, wordless, with a look of astonishment on his face. Then he said, "I am Chris Meiklejohn." Then it was my turn to stare in astonishment. It had been 45 years since I had been in his class, and neither of us could have known that we would cross paths again at a memorial service so many years later, or that his question would provoke me to cast my memory back nearly half a century to my first year of university. And he never would have known the depth of the influence he had on my life if serendipity, or was it grace, hadn't led to our unlikely conversation. "A teacher affects eternity," wrote the historian Henry Brooks Adams. And teachers can never tell where their influence stops. For me, in a single year, 8 months really, Chris Meiklejohn had a profound influence on my life. And I probably wouldn't be here in this pulpit if the study of anthropology hadn't led me to a focus on religion and folklore, and if the focus on religion and folklore hadn't led me into the ministry. It's a good story, I think, a positive outcome, an influence for the better. And I have been grateful for it my entire adult life, And I was grateful to have the opportunity to tell the professor what a difference he had made. But sometimes our relationships with teachers are more complicated. Just as many have complicated relationships with their parents or other family members, it's natural that most of us, if not all of us, may have had complicated relationships with a teacher or two along our journey through life. Not every encounter I've had with an old teacher has been a pleasant experience. When I was nearly 40 years old, and I hadn't been in her classroom for some 25 of those years, I was overcome with emotion when I saw one of my middle school teachers. Her appearance was little changed from when she had been my teacher, so I would have recognized her anywhere, unlike my experience with Chris Meiklejohn. She was focused on the task at hand in the grocery store and quite oblivious to the people around her. I was pretty sure that she scowled at the children nearby, but perhaps I was just projecting. My heart began to race. My palms became cold and sweaty. Right there in the produce aisle, I worried that I might throw up at any moment. This is no exaggeration. It was an overwhelming emotional experience. Twice she had been my homeroom teacher, although she left the profession halfway through the second go-round. She was one of only 2 or 3 teachers I never really liked. Now, you would think that after a quarter of a century, I would have gotten over it. But there I was, fondling the lettuce and tomatoes, 40 years old, going on 12. Looking back, it's not like she ever did anything truly dreadful to me. So I was surprised and inwardly embarrassed by the intensity of my reaction at seeing her. It took me a while to admit that she had not been so awful, that she had not been awful so much as inadequate to my needs at the moment. Most of the teachers I experienced as a youngster were warm, approachable, reliable, and intelligent, even if they could sometimes be demanding. In contrast, this teacher had always seemed cool, distant, unpredictable, and, as I recall, not especially knowledgeable about the subjects she taught, which inevitably led to a measure of conflict with the smart-ass kid who was me. Even then, long before I had ever developed a sense of personal vocation, she didn't strike me as someone who loved her profession. Why is my dislike of this particular teacher so intense? For the most part, I loved my teachers. I mean, loved them. She was unique, or nearly so. Every other teacher I recall from those years made some positive impact on me that I can remember and claim and appreciate. Even teachers who were simply average, or perhaps even delightfully mediocre, they all had a positive impression. Even teachers I didn't have warm relationships with, and those whose students murmured about them. Even those who sometimes frightened me, such as Mr. Mikowski with his loud yardstick that he would bang on desks to get our attention. Everyone, save for the teacher in the produce aisle, who I cannot remember imparting any knowledge, any value, any inspiration, any motivation, had an influence in my life. And as it turns out, I didn't realize the influence she had had on me until that day in the produce aisle. You see, when I've told this story to old school chums that I bump into from time to time, their memories of her are pretty much akin to mine, even if they haven't held their feelings with such intensity. Then again, none of them have seen her in person since she dropped out of our lives over Christmas break in the 8th grade. Yet, although this teacher didn't inspire my love for a particular subject, impart some bit of knowledge that I still occasionally rely upon, or motivate me in some way or another, she nevertheless contributed directly to my self-awareness, my sense of right and wrong, and my resilience in facing the world. She taught me that we have to learn to deal with difficult people in our lives. And I suppose that she also taught me to work at something I love or to find something else to do. So I can't honestly say I learned nothing from her. And I like to think that I wouldn't have the same visceral reaction 25 years later, since half a century has now passed since I was in her classroom. But she did teach me something, even if it was a hard lesson. Overwhelmingly, though, I appreciated and even admired the teachers I've had. Beginning with Mrs. McDonald in the 1st grade, who taught my aunt during her first year teaching when she was still Miss Lund, and me during her last. She spent her entire career at one school, where by the time I had her, she was something of a weekday grandmother to the children in her care, teaching us about the Assiniboine people for whom the school was named, and Edith Cavell, the legendary nurse for whom a nearby street was named, as well as Helen Keller, who I believe she met in the flesh. Then there was Mrs. Doshin in 3rd grade, on whom I had a boyish crush. She came to Winnipeg from Nova Scotia and later moved to Ontario, where she became an authority on special education in Ottawa. I will spare you a long recitation of the names of all the teachers who shaped me, who I have been thinking about with such great fondness throughout the summer. But I would like to say that it was in high school that I discovered the truth of the Roman philosopher Seneca's assertion, "My joy in learning is partly that it enables me to teach." It was then that I realized that a teacher's own love of learning was a more powerful tool in their teaching than the most carefully crafted curriculum, and that unleashing teachers to impart their passions was far more valuable than forcing them to teach what was likely to appear on the standardized tests. What we have lost as a society, and what our neighbors have lost in an even greater degree by forcing teachers into molds and obliging them to comply with the curricula often created and sanctioned by those who know nothing about childhood education. What a price we have paid. You see, the lessons that have stuck with me throughout the years were those that my teachers imparted from their own life experiences and their love for the subjects they taught, more than those that were on the curriculum. As important as the curriculum really is in helping to shape a teacher's approach to the subject at hand. The Irish poet William Butler Yeats insisted that education is not the filling of a pail, but the lighting of a fire. And this may explain why a former high school teacher from Minnesota has rocketed to fame as everybody's coach in the span of only a month. Tim Walz, who may well become the next Vice President of the United States, has captured the imagination of our neighbors, or at least 48% of them, according to recent polls, because he has been revealed to be the kind of teacher we all loved when we were in school. After decades of dismissive rhetoric about teachers, the excellence of teachers is once again being proclaimed in the public square, and the exploits of one high school teacher turned politician who took a football team from last place to the championship, who taught civics, whose experience of hungry and impoverished students led him to pass legislation to feed every student so they had the nourishment and energy to learn, and whose mentoring in civics led his students to challenge him to seek public office, has reminded us all of the dignity of teaching. I believe that teaching is the noblest profession in the world, the most dignified vocation to which anyone can aspire. And I have sometimes regretted that I didn't choose it as my own, or at least consider university chaplaincy as the best venue for ministry. As the British social commentator Harriet Martineau wrote in the 19th century, "What office is there which involves more responsibility, which requires more qualifications, and which ought therefore to be more honorable than that of teaching?" It's only been a month, but I see our neighbors celebrating teachers again, and this is one trend that I would welcome crossing the border. Teaching and learning are critical to our individual and collective survival and the quality of our lives, according to Parker Palmer. The pace of change has us snarled in complexities, confusions, and conflicts that will diminish us or do us in if we do not enlarge our capacity to teach and to learn. And so it is essential that we recognize the dignity of the teacher's calling. And the beginning of the school year is as good a time to do this as any. It's essential that we honor their work and equip them with the resources they need to educate young and old alike. That we support their inner lives so that they may bring their best selves to the classroom, or wherever it is that they impart knowledge and offer their example. It is essential that we cherish and challenge the human heart that is the source of good teaching. Please join in hymn number 300, "With Heart and Mind."